We all have a story. We have many stories. And today, having the honor to stand in front of you, I want to tell you my story, this story of rising and story of being able to go from a sense of being violated, an experience of being violated, trauma, to this place of victory. And all stories have a beginning. And mine begins in this contrast of two different days. And I think we've all had the experience where two consecutive days can be radically different, how the first day can be boring, average, ordinary, but the very next day can sometimes be a day like we've never had in our entire lives. And this day, August 31st, the day after an ordinary day, August 31st, 2011, was in fact a day like I'd never had before, because this was the day that I was going to kill myself. This is the day that the monster, as I call clinical depression, had finally, after trying passionately for close to 40 years, convinced me beyond a shadow of a doubt on that day that indeed I was worthless, that I was useless, that I had no redeeming value, that I was weak and stupid and pitiful and grotesque, that everything about me was terrible. And the thing that broke my spiritual back, my mental back, my psychological back was on that particular day, I believed, albeit illogical, I believed that everybody in my then life, my former wife, Deanna, my family, my friends, I believed that each and every one, their life would improve dramatically if I would just kill myself. And at the time, my former wife, Dee, and I were living just a little bit above Rockland in a little town. It was really Hamlet-like-esque in the sense it was perfect. It was magical, called Penrith. And we lived on this 2.5-acre parcel. And I remember waking up on that day. And of course, here in Northern California, there was no chance of rain. There was not even any clouds in the sky. It was like Michelangelo had come overnight and painted this beautiful rendition of what a perfect blue sky would be. And I did a final walk around the perimeter of the property, then sat down at the computer and typed out my suicide note. To my beloved Deanna, my family, and my friends, I have decided that the time has come for me to go. I am choosing to end my life so I can be free of the pain in my heart and soul, the betrayal of my mind, and the depth of self-hatred that I feel. I have become the burden I wish I never would, and a drag on those around me. I am a damaged shell of a boy, not yet close to what a man should be. Everyone will be much better off without me. I am so very sorry. And I took the note off the printer, and then I got in my red Dodge Dakota pickup truck and made the short 20-minute drive from our home in Penryn to the Forest Hill Bridge. Now, you may not know that at 730 feet, the Forest Hill Bridge is 500 feet further off the ground than its more famous cousin in San Francisco. And this was not the first time I had driven to the bridge. I had made countless trips to the bridge because I had been plagued by suicidal ideations for close to 4 decades. And this brings up an important point that suicide is almost never spontaneous. People like me are oftentimes plagued with thoughts of killing themselves thousands of times, and this had been my experience. So I even knew where I was going to park on that particular day. And I brought my red truck. Interesting to think about it now, even the truck was flashing emergency danger, help needed. Brought it to a rest, turned off the ignition, and then sat there for a second, eyes closed, and then took a deep breath, reached over, grabbed the suicide note, and then I placed the note right in the center of the dash. And then I took the keys out of the ignition and I placed those in the center of the note, and I exited the vehicle, and I had this thought, I got to make sure that the door's unlocked. Turn slightly to my right, in fact it was, turn back the other direction, walk down a path and come to the closest end of the bridge deck. Now the bridge is 2,000 feet. And the view from either side, as you can see from the picture, many of you have traveled to the bridge. It is spectacular. It is awe-inspiring. But on that particular day, it was as if the monster had handed me a paper towel roll. And all I could see was the light post that stood right at the midpoint, at the highest point above the North Fork of the American River, 730 feet. That's all I could see is that light post. Couldn't see the view. And so I made my way to the light post. Upon arriving, I turned to my left. The suicide barrier hit me right across the chest, and I bent forward. It was almost like the monster had shoved my head down and says, "You worthless being, you piece of trash, this was where you will land here momentarily." And again, still with the paper towel view in my hand, I focused on a circular spot in the North Fork of the American River. And then I closed my eyes a second time. And I was imagining, what's the easiest way up and over this rail? And I'd done the calculation. It was going to take me 7.5 seconds to fall 730 feet. And I'd thought about, what's that fall going to feel like? And the only uncertainty I had, I was clear about what I needed to do. What would that, in fact, be the most selfless thing, illogical, but what would be the most selfless thing, the gift I would give to my family, getting rid of me? The only uncertainty I had is, would I feel the impact? Would I feel the indescribable pain? And at that point, as I'm sure you can appreciate, my mind is racing. My thoughts are spinning out of control to the point where time, like we understand it, got pushed to the side out of my experience. And so I do not know, 10 years later, how long I stood stretched out in this position, focused, where I was going to be dropped, tossed over this rail. But thankfully, it was long enough for a driver to passing by to look upon that scene and have this feeling, thankfully, this knowing that something's not right with this picture. That person making an emergency call, and then a heroic sheriff's deputy from Placer County approached me from the left-hand side and did two critical things. First thing he did was establish contact, which is logistical. But then he created connection, which is life-saving, because connection creates hope, and hope saves lives. I was taken off the bridge to an emergency room and then ultimately to a psychiatric hospital, a loony bin, a psych ward, a nutcase. This is where people go who have lost their mind, who are out of their mind. And at 48 years old then, not only had I never been to a psych ward, I never knew anybody who had been to a psych ward. And all I could think about was one flew over a cuckoo's nest. But when I got to that place, unexpectedly, there was a certain energy to it, an energy that I didn't expect. It was calming. And so I went into that place. But when people found out I was there and why, to say they were confused, to say they couldn't wrap their mind around it, it would be the greatest understatement of all time, because people didn't see me as mentally ill. People didn't see me as clinically depressed. People saw me as one half of a committed couple who ran this extraordinary animal sanctuary called A Chance for Bliss. And if you like companion animals, you would have loved the sanctuary. The sanctuary was home to as many as 100 animals at any one time: 25 horses, 23 dogs, 9 potbelly pigs, goats and sheep and ducks and geese and bunnies and birds and turtles and fish. This whole representation, kind of like a Noah's Ark on this 2.5-acre parcel in this beautiful little hamlet of Penryn. And Deanna and I, my former beloved, we were really specific. We started off on this journey. We wanted the throwaways, the unadoptables, those companion animals who had been discarded due to age or condition. And so for an animal to punch their ticket to come to the sanctuary, they had to be very old, very sick, have some sort of special need, or the vast majority were at the end of life. And so we did no adoptions. We were the quintessential forever home, and we became well known. We became well known not just in the United States, but throughout the world. And we, on June 2nd, 2010, we were the cover story in the life section of USA Today. I didn't fit the image of mental illness. I didn't fit the image of that soul who's standing in the median strip, who's saying things that are incomprehensible, who looks smelly and dirty. But that brother and I share a common malady. I didn't fix the picture. That wasn't who people thought I was. But the truth is, sometimes what hurts the most can't be seen. Sometimes great despair and soul-crushing, hope-killing agony lies just behind a forced smile, a distracting joke, or in this case, a seemingly perfect and ideal life. And because of that, and because of the fact that I was a great actor, because of the fact that I hid behind the velocity of my life, there was nothing that my family could have done to stop it. Deanna did not know. And just 14 short months after this mountaintop experience of being in USA Today, there I was on a dark spot, on a tall, tall bridge, on the literal edge of killing myself. But my story was not to end that day. Life had another plan. I was to, in fact, be alive, not just on that day, but 10 years later. And in fact, on a day I thought would be my last day alive, it was instead the first day of this brand new life and the first steps in what has now been a decade-long journey away from mental hellness and into the experience of our birthright, mental health. Mental health is not a privilege. Just like freedom and democracy, mental health is an inalienable right that every single sentient being is afforded when they burst into this life experience. And this is a great day for me to have the honor here of telling my story. Here's what I'd like to share with you. The first thing is I want to answer the question is, why do people kill themselves? And then I want to give you an idea of what it feels like to be under the attack of the monster, because I still have my days. There are still days I wake up and I can feel the cold hand of the monster literally trying to choke the breath out of me. There are still days I have the occasional thought of suicide. And I also want to tell you, what was the cause of this condition? And as you can imagine, trauma played a starring role. And then what do I do to continue to move away from hellness into the place of wellness? And ultimately, what can we do? What can we do individually? What can we do from a societal standpoint to help people move from a place of violation to victory? So the first question is why? And it's an agonizing question, either in the face of someone who has attempted to end their life or someone who unfortunately has ended their life. And there's a whole variety of answers to that. I won't pretend to have every, but I want to provide you with a quote from an individual who's had his own fight with bipolar, in this case, who I believe provides a foundation from which all answers to this horrible question come about. David Chang is a Gordon Ramsay-like Michelin star winning famous chef. And he says this, in fact, I heard this on a radio show. I had to pull my car over because this answers this question. It is the foundation, which he says that when you're depressed, you become convinced that everything you think is true. Let me say that again. When you're depressed, you become convinced that everything you think is true. Now, we've all had bizarre thoughts. We've all had thoughts in which we feel less than. But imagine, and I can relate to this, that all of those thoughts collectively you believe to be true. They're not logical, they're not factual, they're not based on any empirical data, but you believe them to be true. People would ask me, David, dear God, why did you want to kill yourself? And I say, because I believe that I was worthless and useless, that I was pitiful and grotesque, that I had no redeeming value, that I embarrassed you, that your life would be better without me. Which answers the second why. David, why would you want to be so selfish? Why would you want to hurt us so much? And I say, because I didn't think I'd hurt you. I thought I would benefit you. And what I tell people is suicide has nothing to do with facts or truth or reason. Suicide is about belief. And belief, like faith, is highly personal. When we are in a position of passionate belief or faith, you can present us with all kinds of data, all kinds of proof. It's not going to move us off that position. And so I think it's important that we understand that when we encounter somebody like me, to understand that they are not in a crazy space, but they're in a position of belief that if we understand it, if we can accept it, if we can appreciate it, we can then move to a different space to be of assistance. And now what happens is those thoughts trigger these overwhelming emotions. So what does it feel like? In all the years as I've tried to explain this, I still don't feel like I do a good job, but let me explain it this way. Each and every one of us has had a toothache at one point. And the thing about a toothache is there's no way we can avoid it. We can't forget about it. It's not like an ache that we can put to the side because we get busy. The toothache just permeates and colors and impacts everything that we do. So imagine now you've had that toothache, not just for a day, not just for a week, but for 10 or 20 or 30 years. Now imagine a time that you've been more sad than you can recall. Maybe you've endured a heartbreak. Maybe you had to say goodbye to a beloved pet. Maybe your mom or your dad or your grandfather or your grandmother, or maybe you've had the horror of losing a child. Just imagine the depth of the worst period of time when you've experienced a sense of sadness is like a tidal wave. It's like jumping into a pool of blue in which you feel like you're drowning. And then imagine a time that you've been disgusted with yourself. Like you feel like you've done something that's unforgivable, that you've disappointed somebody. Maybe you lied, maybe you cheated, maybe you stole. And you are overwhelmed with this experience of self-hatred. You look in the mirror and you say, I hate you. I don't want anything to do with you. And then imagine a time that you've been so fatigued, so tired, that you literally don't have the energy to put one foot in front of the other. And then take all those things and put them in a mixing bowl and mixing them together. And then fashion this heavy winter coat and then soak it in water so it is so heavy, and then wear that. And then have your arms tied behind your back and then step into a boxing ring and be surrounded by combatants that feel good, that they're virile, that they have energy and strength. And then the bell rings and you're supposed to fight them. That's about what it feels like every single day. And if you were to put a picture on it, it looks a lot like this. This is Winston. On the day he came to the sanctuary, one of those beautiful Boston Terriers that I'm obsessed with, Winston had in fact been used as a bait dog in a dogfighting ring. And it's an awful image that I use with great intention because I need you to understand what it feels like. We may not show this picture in the literal sense, but this is what we feel like on the inside. It might even feel like this particular beautiful pup, beautiful for me because her name was Hope, but in this place, she had lost all hope. And the picture again is how we feel on the inside. And it's difficult because people oftentimes don't recognize it because it's invisible, but it doesn't mean it's not real for us. And what happens is we ultimately go into a place of hopelessness. And I, for one, believe that people don't die from mental illness. They don't die from schizophrenia or bipolar. They die from hopelessness. Without hope, why live? David, why did you want to kill yourself? And I say, because I didn't believe there was any hope. I didn't believe there was hope that the pain would end. Didn't believe that there was hope that I would view myself differently, that I would be of value to you. And ultimately, what happens is, in the words of Andrew Solomon, that the opposite of depression isn't happiness, it's vitality. Somebody like me, we have not lost our will to live. Please don't ever say that, because will is about discipline and effort and goal setting and moving one step in front of the other. We have not lost our will to live. We have lost our want to live. There is no reason to live. And those are two distinctive things, because I think what happens is when somebody like myself is on the verge or unfortunately ends their life, we think, well, they lost their willpower. No, we haven't. We've lost our want. And we get into the place of hopelessness in which there is no reason to live. And that is the place that I went into, the feeling, when I went into the psychiatric ward. And as mentioned, things change in a way that I never expected. Second day, I sat down with a psychiatrist. And there was just something about this guy that he didn't have a lab coat on. He didn't have a stethoscope. And he just had this energy that was welcoming. I didn't expect it. And we started to talk, and we started to talk about animals. We started to talk about football, and then we started to talk about dogs. And I'm like, oh man, don't get me started about dogs. And he said, he was almost apologetic. He said, I got to ask you a couple medical questions. I'm like, and then I'm like, all right, here it comes. But he asked me two that I never considered. The first was, David, is there any history of mental illness in your family? And my mind went blank. And in fact, to be honest, I actually was appalled that he had the audacity to ask me that question. How dare you suggest that there's some history of mental illness in my lineage? Which underscores the incestuous nature of stigma, that we can even just put it out of our mind that it's okay. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong. And I said, doctor, no. But then I thought, well, wait a second. Now that I think about it, my grandfather, my father's father, had killed himself when my father was very young. And my father died when I was very young. And while I don't have a lot of memories about him, my three older brothers, John, Jim, and Tom, had shared with me stories of how our dad was overwhelmed, incapacitated, burdened with clinical depression, and it just weakened him. And ultimately, the other monster of cancer just scooped up the remains of his want to live. And the doctor then said, now, David, realize that mental illness, like any illness, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, you can have a genetic predisposition. It's not unusual. But like those other maladies, it doesn't mean that you as a person is going to suffer from it. But with a genetic predisposition around mental illness, if you can imagine it, David, it's just like dry kindling, and you're going to start a campfire. You need something to light it. And he said the agonizing truth is that thing is oftentimes trauma. And he looked at me in this way that he was colored with compassion. And I love the definition that calls compassion curiosity without assumption. He said, David, have you experienced any trauma? And again, no one had ever asked me that question. My mind went blank. And certain people can pick up nonverbal clues. And he said, well, David, you said you were young when your father died. How old were you? And I said, Doctor, I was just 7. And he said, oh, I am so sorry. For a child to lose their father at such a tender young age, that's traumatic. And there was something within him that propelled him to say, has there been anything else? And in fact, there was something else, something so horrific that I had kept locked inside for 48 years. But this man had created this safe place. And before I could actually give it some sort of thought, I said, Doctor, when I was 11 years old, I was a new member of a Boy Scout troop. And not long after joining the troop, one night my mom dropped me off, and an assistant scoutmaster said, Miss Bartley, I'm happy to take David home. And my mom thought, well, great, thank you so much. And we got in the car, and remember, he was this huge man. We had this talk. I was sitting in the front seat with him, and we're making the way home. But right before we get home, there's a stop sign, and we turn to the right. And I remember feeling confused because I'm like, well, that's a dead-end street that goes to a park. Why are we going there? And we drove down the road, and we went into the park, and there are no lights. And the only thing we can see is from the headlights of his car. And we go into like the furthest recess of the parking lot, and he stops the car and turns off the engine. And he looks at me, and now this once friendly countenance that he had completely changed. And he looked at me and he said, get in the back. And I got in the back, and he got out and walked around and sat on the back seat with me. And then he ordered me to take off all my clothes. And then he proceeded to sodomize and violate and rape me for what seemed like an eternity. And when he was done, he said, get out of the car. Get back in the front seat. And I did. And he slid into the front seat, and we drove home in perfect silence. And we had been so close. We stopped the car, and as we were pulling up to my house, I just thought, okay, as soon as the car stops, I'm going to jump out. And I went to, but he grabbed me and he spun me around until I was 1 inch from his face. And he said, what happened is an initiation, and all the boys go through it, but we don't talk about it. And as the last part of the story came out of my mouth that I shared in front of this doctor, I began to berate myself. Why on earth did I share this? Because I had held shame for all those years. Why didn't I run away when I got out of the car? Why did I just stay there? Why did I go back and just lie there and allow myself to be violated? And then this man, in the most unlikely of places, this psychiatrist I'm sitting knee to knee with, reaches forward just like a father would to his son. And he takes my hands in his, and he looks at me and he said, David, this is not your choice. You didn't choose your genetics, and you didn't choose your trauma. You didn't choose this. But then he said 4 incredibly simple and yet sacred words that he looked at me and he said, it's not your fault. Now, the first time he said it, I couldn't hear it. It was so opposite of what the monster had convinced me for decades that like I could see his mouth moving, but I couldn't hear a sound. It just didn't make sense. It was like he was speaking Portuguese, a different language. And this man, picking up nonverbal clues, held my hand just a little bit tighter and said, hear me, son, hear me. It's not your fault. And we're here today because there are courageous people in Calaveras County who want us to understand trauma so we can provide the space for healing like me. And I ran across a quote that I believe underscores what the impact of trauma is, in which it says, trauma fractures comprehension as a pebble shatters a windshield. The wound at the site of impact spreads across the field of vision, obscuring reality and challenging belief. Absolutely. It changes a person's life in a way that's hard to explain, impacts them, leaves a mark, leaves scar tissue that is almost impossible to heal unless you're in the space of the people here in this extraordinary county. And then over the next 15 days, I learned how to be well. I learned that, in fact, I need to put my self-care on a pedestal. Nothing is more important. To keep me well, I must care for myself, body, mind, and spirit. And I've created a wellness plan that works for me. Everybody's plan is different. It's about diet and sleep and exercise. It's about therapy. It's about psychiatry. It's about peer support, which I think may be the most important thing, because a great acronym of HOPE is hearing other people's experiences. It's about embracing my wonderful medication that works. It's about a spiritual foundation that works for me. And then this is my purpose. This is what I do. The sanctuary no longer exists, but I endeavor to travel around the world now and wrap this subject in animal story to give people proximity, but understanding. And the other part that's unique, that may seem counterintuitive in regards to self-care, is this whole thing about loss and grief. Every single one of us over these last close to 2 years has experienced some sort of loss. But the problem is oftentimes we rank our loss, we compare our loss. Well, there are the children who are starving in Africa. Yes, they are. And that is a terrible thing. But it doesn't mean that we might need to minimize the feelings that we have a right to in regards to loss. It's all right. And I like to distinguish loss and grief are in fact not synonymous. Loss is the experience. Grief is the process, which is the natural response to loss. Grief is actually not the enemy. Grief is our friend. Grief wants to move us through in difficult ways that ultimately have our best intention in hand to a place where we can process these thoughts and emotions. And Naomi Remen wrote a great book called Kitchen Table Wisdom. And in the last part of this quote, in which she was sharing with care workers, healthcare workers, and doctors, calls that people who burn out doesn't mean that they don't care. What it means is they haven't grieved. They haven't taken the time to process this loss that each and every one of us, especially now, has experienced. And he says that grieving is a way of self-care. And she says the antidote to professionalism. We don't need to show up as these perfect human beings. We need to grieve. But of everything that I do in terms of body, mind, and spirit, it's all about connection. There is no way for us to be well alone. It is impossible. We must be connected. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the three most important words in mental health are connection, connection, connection. Let me put it to you this way, that if you take the word illness and you swap out I with we, there is this transformation, almost like a magic trick right in front of us, that illness becomes wellness. We can become well together. And the great Brene Brown, on a quote that I have dropped in front of me, which is the best definition of connection, in which she says, I define connection as the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from the relationship. Like, amen, this is it. This is why connection is the most incredible thing. And connection transformed the animals that Dee and I saw like hundreds of times. We took care of the whole of who they are along with other people that supported us. And so you look at this picture of Winston, this is what depression looks and feels like. But when Winnie was connected, he looked like this. He went from skinny and scarred and beaten and bruised to solid and strong and bold and beautiful. And to be honest, a brat. He was just a brat. But Dee liked to say when they got a little jerky, that was a good thing. They got their personality back. And again, that this condition of mental illness, like our beautiful pup Hope, it can cover you with a stench, a terrible feeling. You just look in the mirror and you can't believe the disgust that you have. But connection is like a pair of shears. It's like a pair of trimmers. And in this case, all of that weight of depression, the stench, the view off our beautiful puppy Hope went away. And connection is just so extraordinary. But the beautiful thing about connection is that you only need a small amount. Now, this is Max. Max is what's called an Italian greyhound. And what Max believed was that if a person was sitting on the couch, if there was just the smallest opening, like the size of his nose, he could work his way in. And before a person knew, like all of a sudden there's this dog unfolded in his lap. Where did it come from? Because people were a little intimidated by all these dogs. Well, I love the story because what it says to us is we as human beings, so hardwired, so desiring, so wanting connection, we only need just a little opening, which on the opposite side or the other side of that coin means we only need to project a small opening. We don't need to run across a beach like a star-crossed lover. That's not everybody's gig. But if we can show just a little opening, that matching up with the searching of an opening, we can have connection. And there's 3 steps: recognition, understanding, and expression. The first thing we need to do if we want to connect with somebody is to recognize them. Like, we have to validate their existence. And I love the definition in which it says that when we recognize somebody, we acknowledge you're worthy. I want to connect with you. I'm happy to give you my effort. And I think that one of the best ways for me, one of the funnest ways in terms of getting to know somebody is, let me know your name. Now, we adults will say, well, I'm no good at remembering names. But we need to underscore what the great Dale Carnegie said, is said to a person, the sound of that person's name is the sweetest sound in any language. And it is. Think about a time that somebody remembered your name and you had no expectation that they would. Like, how did that feel? Did that not feel like you were recognized, maybe on a day when you felt invisible? And there's lots of different ways that you can recognize and remember people's names. And one of the ways I teach is to ask people, what's the story behind your name? Because we all have a story. Most all of us have a story about our name. And I was at a conference and teaching nursing students. And I said, does anybody here have a story about their name? And there was this young woman sitting in the front row. And she paused, and I said, really, somebody's got to have a story about their name. And very hesitantly, she raised her hand. And I'm like, oh my gosh, thank you. Do you have a story? And she says, yes, I was named after a chipmunk. Okay, what? I said, is your name Alvin? She said, no, my name's Brittany. Brittany was Alvin's girlfriend. Okay, I'm going to tell your story for the rest of my life. And it's fun. It's just, I will never forget her. But it's just a way to just recognize the soul. And then we go into the place of understanding. And I think that what we need to realize is that once we understand anything, things change. And Thomas Berger wrote a book called Little Big Man, in which he says that the art and science of asking questions is the source of all knowledge. Kids know this, right? They're like an endless stream. They don't do it with any sort of shame. They just say, no, I want to know, because if I understand, things differ. And the great Mr. Rogers says that, frankly, there's no one you can't learn to love once you know their story. And once you know their story, oftentimes you're surprised. Now, this is Adia, A-D-I-A. Adia was one of the geese. Over my right shoulder is Mercy, Grace, and Dave. Now, the interesting thing about Adia is he would let me hold him. And we had this beautiful pond. It was huge in the back pasture. And so on the day Adia arrived, I put him right on the cusp of what was perfect for him. Like, it was clean, there was a fountain and everything else. There was these new friends. But instead of moving toward that which was in his best interest, he jumped into this small bathtub-sized water trough that was there on the edge of the pond for the other farm animals to drink out of. We bring people to the literal cusp of all these mental health resources and things that we know will help you, and they sometimes jump back into the small bathtub-sized water trough of their suffering. I don't understand. I thought, well, maybe he's stressed, and I pick him up and I put him back on the edge and he jumps back in. Well, we do this 10 times. I move along the spectrum from, that's kind of interesting, to you're actually being a little annoying. Okay, now I'm getting angry. D, the brilliant one, comes, looks upon the situation, assesses it, realizes her then husband is losing his patience, goes in, makes a call to the rescue organization who had rescued Adia and brought him to us and said, honey, guess what I found out? Adia had lived his whole life in the small, teeny confines of somebody's backyard. The only water Adia had ever seen was the water in a teeny kiddie pool. Now I understand. People come to the edge of mental health resources to try to alleviate the pain from their trauma. They tried medication, they had a bad experience. They went to a therapist who didn't listen. They feel like no one will understand them, and they go back in. At least suffering is familiar. So I had to sit down at the water trough and think, wow, what a lesson that Deanna has helped me to come understand. So I thought, okay. But here's the interesting thing. In the place of understanding, hearing this sentient being story, I had this thought, the solution, not available to me when I didn't understand. I thought, God, I can just get a second water trough. So there I sit, Adia swimming in his water trough, Mercy, Grace, Dave doing their other thing. 5 minutes later, I notice to the left, Adia has popped up out of the water trough, walks around my back and sits right next to me, and then literally looks up at me. And I was hoping in the moment that he was forgiving me. I was waiting for him to embrace me. 5 minutes after that, he walked right back to that same edge where I had placed him initially, looks out at Mercy, Grace, and Dave, looks at the water trough, back at me, eyes front, swims into the pond. Understanding creates connection. Unless a soul is connected, they will never move forward to what is in their best interest. But conversely, when they feel connected, there is this exponential increase in the possibility that they will. We need to leverage curiosity. First question out of the mouth of the first responder, counterintuitive, was, David, what does it feel like to be depressed? The reality is curiosity slows the speed of thought. It's a counterintuitive question, but it's actually the thing that kept me on the safe side of the rail. And then he said, David, how long have you lived with this condition? And the most audacious question was, David, what's it like on your worst days? And he asked, and then he listened, underscoring again what the great Dr. Remen says is that our listening creates a sanctuary for the homeless parts in another person. And then he pivoted. He said, David, what's it like on your best days? And then the last question, the question that had me push back is, David, what do you want the rest of your life to look like? And in that moment, that invisible yet real paper towel that I was holding, the paper towel roll, it's like I let it go and you could watch it just slowly drift down. And I took in the view and we retraced our steps together, middle-aged man to middle-aged man. And then the exclamation point on that extraordinary experience is when he looked at me and he said, David, thank you for telling me how you feel. Recognition, understanding, and then expression. And we got to know now, people, we got to know, brothers and sisters, forgive me, as like being a preacher, that we got to let people know how we feel. William James said it best when he said that the deepest principle in human nature is the craving to be appreciated. Dear God, please let me know that I am of value to you. And we can do it in a lot of different ways, but I think it's a good old-fashioned handwritten note that will always be in style. Now, until 5 years ago, quite frankly, August 31st of every year was the worst day of the year. I hate summer. I know it's illogical. I just don't like it. I'm a January baby. I like it cold. And here in Northern California, it's too hot. Like, what's 100 degrees? Like, what's the whole purpose of that? I just, even as a kid, in fact, what happens is my biorhythm, I actually have a difficulty time. It's not so much when it gets darker, when there's less light. I actually have an issue when there's more light. I don't know why it is. I'm weird. It's just the way that it is. And so you take that. In fact, I hate summer. And then it's coupled with this time when I felt like I had lost my will, quite frankly, even though that's not the case. That's how I felt. So 5 years ago, I wake up on that day. I'm angry. I'm mad. I don't want this day. I just want this day to be over. And I go to the mailbox, and there's that uniquely sized envelope. But on the return address, it was from a Miss Leslie Bowers, and it was a Pooh Bear return address label. I'm like, I don't know, Leslie. Leslie, why are you bothering me on this day? And I don't even want to open it. And I say, okay, I'll open it. And it's this card. And you can't see it, but it's a picture of a glacier. And it says, advice from a glacier, carve your own path. Go slow. Channel your strings. Whatever. I don't want this today. And I want to fling it like a Frisbee, but I thought, okay, who would have the audacity to open this up? And on the inside, it says, happy today. It's from my sneaky friend, Greg, who's like a brother, who's walked a similar path, who put his mother-in-law's return address to throw me off. And he says, hey, just a note to remind you that you are an extraordinary person with so much to give so many others. You are a tremendous source of healing just by your personable presence. This is not only my sentiment, so many others also believe in you. Believe in yourself, reject the lies. I love you. As a result of a folded piece of paper being sent with great intention to make sure it showed up on that day, August 31st of every year went from the worst day of the year to my New Year's Day. And every August 31st, just like this last one, I drive back to the bridge. And I park my vehicle in the same spot I did 10 years ago. But there is no note. And I lock the door because I'm coming back. And this last year, just a little while ago, was the best of all. Because my beloved, my fiance, whose name just happens to be Summer, which I think is pretty great. We woke up that morning, she says, honey, I want to go with you. So I don't need to tell you, like, the contrast of 10 years ago until just a couple months ago. All because somebody took the time to make sure I knew that I was important, that I was valued, that I was loved. And I realize now I don't need to go back anymore. That's what can happen. And I think if we follow this path, and it's all about the support that other people give us, we will in fact become resilient. And I looked at the definition of resilience. I didn't like it as much as I love this quote, that resilience is very different than being numb. Resilience means that you experience, you feel, you fail, you hurt, you fall, but you keep going. When we become resilient, it doesn't mean that we're immune to the difficulties of life, but we can move on because people have allowed us to remember the truth of who we are. And I think about, like, what does it feel like to have peace of mind and self-worth? This is the picture. This is Buddy. And I just love this picture because it's not just that everything's okay, it's that everything's gonna be okay. We are in the midst of a very difficult set of circumstances right now. This trauma, and trauma is trauma. I have a certain experience of trauma, but it doesn't mean that your trauma is any less. Trauma is personal. All trauma leaves a mark. And if we don't follow the lead of the courageous souls who have created a conference like this and continue to advocate for people like me, there are going to be far too many souls who suffer. And in that place of indescribable suffering and what seems to be endless suffering, we get into the place of hopelessness, and people will in fact continue to take their lives at a rate that is just, it's unacceptable. We can do something about this. And I love this quote by Dr. Ramsey. Dr. Ramsey is an esteemed psychiatrist from New York, and I love it in a much more brief way than I can do. He poses the problem and the solution in a simple quote. And he says that someone you see today is thinking about killing themselves. Your smile, your question, your love could save them. Trust me, they told me it did. And can you imagine the patient that comes in to sit with this great doctor, and the doctor says, how's it going? He says, you know what? It was a really bad start to the day. And I'll be honest with you, doctor, I was going to kill myself, but there was this person who smiled at me in a way, this person that asked me a question in a way, and there's this person that let me know that I was loved in a way that it saved my life. And it is in fact that simple, because when we can create connection, slow the speed of thought, change the foundation of feeling, arrive at a place of understanding, we can bring them, those like me, to the cusp of resources, and then professionals, amazing professionals, can embrace them and take it to the next step. I am, as paradoxical as it may seem, I'm an optimist. My life has been saved. I know it's possible because people then and now continue to support me on this journey to my right to experience peace of mind, happiness and joy, and mental health. And we will win this fight. We will. So help me, God. So help us, God. We will win it. And when we do, and I'll end with this last story, our story will be just like Odie's story. Now, Odie was a 35-year-old, what they call Tennessee Walker. Now, Tennessee Walker is a gaited horse. If you go on YouTube and type in gaited horse, a gaited horse, what'll happen is you'll see this rider and he's holding a tray of glasses like champagne flutes and nothing spills even though he's riding on a horse. Well, gaited horse just has this fluid moment. And in fact, Odie was a parade pony. He was that pony on like a July 4th Civic Parade. He'd be out in front of everybody and everything with this pride, this prance, this incredible demeanor. But when Odie came to the sanctuary, he was old, he was depressed, he was forlorn, he had been tossed aside and had this bad right hand hip, which like he couldn't stand up straight. He was always leaning to the right. But as soon as his hooves hit sanctuary soil, he began this slow but deliberate transformation from hopelessness to hopefulness. Now, all horses want a job, and Odie was no exception. And so there was no one ad. There was no like to-do list. So Odie just said, you know what? I'm going to be the town crier. Twice a day, morning and the evening, Odie would be the first animal at the gate. And when the other animals saw the grand old leader, the commander, in that front and center position, they would form ranks behind him, and Odie would make his way from the front pasture to the rear pasture where the animals would spend the day luxuriating. Now, on this one day, I opened the gate, and there's Odie kind of moving around, and he went. Now, I never walked in a straight line, and he wasn't real quick, but heaven forbid, the other animals knew, do not go in front of the commander, or you're going to have a price to pay. And so he finally gets everybody over there. I come behind and I shut the gate, and then I go do what I did best, quite frankly, is I go pick up manure, like a lot of manure. And so I'm doing this for a couple hours. I'm doing my thing, thinking, and then all of a sudden I have that feeling, and I spin around, and there to my horror, Odie is down on his bad right-hand hip, right on the edge of that big pond. And then to my added horror, he struggles to get up, loses his balance, and he falls into the pond. And I think, oh my God, he's too weak, he's too old, he's going to drown, he's going to struggle, and he's going to suffer and die. And I'm like, that, and I rush up, come right to the edge of the pond, and I think, well, wait a second. Water is buoyant. He'll be able to regain his footing. But then I paced back and forth for like the next 3 hours, and he tried to stand up and he couldn't. And he tried to stand up and he couldn't. He kept falling, and it's like I could sense that his hope was fading. Now, Dee and I were all about the quality of an animal's experience. It didn't matter if they were there for a short or long period of time. And I realized on that terrible day, I had to make the most difficult decision of all. I had to end my beautiful pony's suffering and help him make his transition to the green pasture in the sky. And so I went inside and had this lengthy conversation with our vet. And we came up with this way to euthanize Odie in the pond, and then we'd take his body out later. Well, by the time I came back, it was evening. Time for the animals to go from the rear pasture back to the front. And there they were all lined up, but it wasn't Odie standing in the primary position, the position that he was always in. It was Prince. Prince, his best friend, this beautiful 30-something caramel color former racing horse, white splash on his forelock, 4 feet, looked like he had dipped them purposely in white paint. He and Odie were always together. They were inseparable. But here was Prince standing in the position of his best friend, honoring him who's in the pond. But Prince is hesitant. He had never been in this position before. He didn't quite frankly know what to do. And so I open the gate, and then Prince very slowly begins to lead the animals to the front pasture. But after 5 steps, he stops, and I'm confused. And then it's like he signaled the other animals, like, no, go by. And when Chrissy, our 3-legged goat, passed him, Prince turned around, walked right back into the rear pasture, stood in the same place that I did with Adia, planted himself, lowered his head, and connected with Odie in this profound, sacred, extraordinary way, this demonstration of connection and brotherhood and love. And I burst into tears. I had never seen anything like this. And I walked up and stood on the left side of Prince, and there we were, like 3 brothers, frozen in this triangular embrace, engaged in this sacred and this solemn, albeit holy goodbye. Or at least that's what I thought. Because 5 minutes later, great horse rose. He finally was able to steady himself. And he was a little shaky at first, but then he was solid. And then he took this slow right-hand turn, and step by step, he made his way out the shallow end of the pond, hooves on dry land, took a sweeping left-hand turn, and then walking up to me, and right before he got to me, he lowered his head and he put it right in the center of my chest. And he moved it back and forth just like puppies do. And in space of witnessing a miracle, I lower my forehead till it rests in his, and I cup his head in my hands, and my tears fall down into his dampness of his coat, and I feel that dampness. I breathe in his essence, his incredible scent, and I feel the vibrance of this magnificent horse. And then he broke apart, and he went nose to nose with his brother. What Prince knew, in the words of the great Randy Pausch, professor from Carnegie Mellon, what Prince knew was that an injured lion still wants to roar. And while I didn't hear the conversation, I am certain it went something like this: Odie saying to Prince, "Thank you, brother." And Prince saying, "I will never leave you." And then the two besties moved apart, and Odie was leaning into Prince, and Prince literally guided him back to the front pasture. And I hadn't recognized, I didn't realize it, that the other animals hadn't started to eat, but when their commander came back and all was right in the world, they all ate together. Now, I'll be honest, Odie didn't live for 3 more months after this extraordinary day. He didn't. Odie didn't live for 3 more weeks. My beloved Odie didn't live for 3 more days. No. Odie lived for 3 more years. That is the power of connection. Martin Luther King reminds us that connection transforms the fatigue of despair into the buoyancy of hope. Emily Dickinson writes that hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without words and never stops at all. I might humbly add that connection creates hope, and hope saves lives. Hope is a pathway. Hope will get us to where we need to go. This is not a hopeless situation. We will follow the lead of those here in Calaveras County and those around the country who are on the tip of the spear, as we will defeat the monster, and we all stand in the high ground of hope, moving from whatever experience of violation to stand on the apex, hands raised in victory. Thank you all so much.
Sounds like quiet out there.
Oh, if there are, I think now we have some time. If you'd like, Scott, for some questions.
Yes, please.
Okay. And any questions at all? If not, I will bore you with more stories. Anything, and Scott will share my cell phone number and also my email address. Please call me. I give this out at the end of every presentation. I am not just, please call me if you'd like to discuss something. When I'm here, my life was saved. My job is to be a servant, to give back, because I still have extraordinary people, amazing people in my life, by family connection, by friend connection, by beloved connection. My former wife and I, Dee, are still great friends. I have all these people who continue to help me. The least I can do, the purpose of my life now, is to give back. In fact, if you say, what is my mission? My mission is to transform mental illness from a disabling condition, trauma from a disabling condition, to a heroic cause. So think about breast cancer. Can you imagine if we said something disparaging about a soul who is fighting breast cancer? We would be taken out to the woodshed. But what happens when something becomes a cause, it has a Teflon coating, stigma can't attach to it. We will arrive at that point.
So got one question.
Okay.
What happened to all the animals on your farm?
So the sanctuary ended. really for some really disappointing reasons, quite frankly. And I have no anger. It was this difficult confluence within, so I got out of the psych hospital on September 15th. By the end of that year, quite frankly, things were worse than when I went in. I lost everything. I mean, literally everything: car, home, animals, marriage, just the whole thing came crumbling. And it was a combination of people didn't understand. People thought, well, if the co-founder is going to kill himself, they can't take care of the animals. We lost our financial support, handed the keys to the repo man, lost our home at foreclosure. The animals were taken to other sanctuaries. And the stress, critical health needs of D&I, it all went away. But I'll tell a quick story about what the importance of connection is, because again, my life was really worse after I got out of the psych hospital. But in the psych hospital, I made up a friend with a guy named Don. The day after he got out, he found this men's depression support group, a group of middle-aged men who met every week for 2 hours, providing support, advice if asked for. And I became a part of that group. And from that group, met my psychiatrist, my therapist, got on different medication. So if you think those group meetings, from the time I got out to the time my life ended, they provided me with this foundation of support and connection, so that come the end of the year, when my life comes completely apart, I had some semblance of hope because of connection. Because had I not, I would not be here today. I would have gone back to the bridge and ended my life. So to finish the question, as I endeavor to honor my former wife and to use the stories of the animals and honor their memory to try to take all these difficult subjects, give people safe proximity where they can relate, and hope each story reminds them of something that they can do.
How do you think your depression related to your childhood experiences?
I think it was, I really do think that it was, the cause was, it was that combination. I think I inherited the genetics of my grandfather and my father. And I think trauma, especially trauma just, it was that match. Oftentimes I wonder, would I have experienced depression had I not had trauma? I don't know. I'm not sure. Unfortunately, I did. Interestingly, I think I followed in the footsteps of my beloved father, James Hamilton Bartley, who he was known by Ham, having his father end his life by suicide, and then he lost his stepfather when he was young, and then he lived most of his life in a boarding school. So he had his own traumatic experience.
Question asked, how do you take care of yourself so that you can keep giving?
It's all about self-care. And I still have a difficult time in my relationship with myself. I do. And I'm not saying that to solicit like, hey, no, you're a good guy. It's just the way that it is. So the one thing I will give myself credit for is I don't miss. I have done more than 300 counseling sessions. I've been part of probably 150 plus groups. It's just because there's a severity in my condition. And I love therapy. I love group. I don't miss. I've never missed a session. I don't miss working out. I eat as well as I can. Unfortunately, though, recently Colonel Sanders got my cell phone number and he texts me because he's a devil. I don't like broccoli. Get outside. I don't miss my medication, they say, and then it's just this transformation. And on the worst days, I realize, as difficult as it is, I'm not here to say that it's easy. It's just, let me go make connection with one person. I'll go to the grocery store and I'll look at somebody's name and I'll ask them, as long as there's not a million people behind me, just say, you know what, what's the story behind your name? And something like that. And here's why connection works. So imagine thoughts, emotions, action, spinning like this. It's like a time bomb. Connection snips one of those wires. Doesn't matter if it's blue, green, yellow, it doesn't matter. Because our minds cannot hold competing thoughts of suicide and life at the same time. It's impossible. So if I go and make connection, like I love the people at the dry cleaner, Sam and Namhi. If I don't even have something to dry clean, let me just go in and say hi, because it's just those small moments. And so that's what I know works. A smile, a question, love could save them. Trust me, they told me it did.
Do you speak to younger audiences, especially those in the middle of trauma?
I do. And really, I'm not a professional. I'm a professional talker. My brother Tom will say, do you sometimes have to put Bengay on your jaws? I'm like, that's rude. I just want to share my experience. And I just want to tell you a story. So I've actually talked to kids as young as kindergarten. Not, it's a different story, but there's where the animal stories. Middle school, high school, seniors, graduate students, military, law enforcement. If there is some group, organization, I'm not a pastor, but I'm a preacher all across the theological spectrum, from Judaism to evangelical. I will just call me. I want to give back. So I talk to anybody who will listen, who will put up with me.
What are your thoughts do you have on connections between peers and youth and the finding hope when the influence is negative or bullying?
That's a great question. Yeah, I'll be honest, in my own naivety, I don't understand bullying. I think, so Parker Palmer is an incredible human being and has this quote that says, violence is what happens when people don't know what to do with their suffering. So so that person who bullies, that's an anguished soul. So I think for the person, as much as you can, and I'm not saying it's easy, is to find at least one other person to just be in support. And oftentimes, again, with the acronym of HOPE, there's two acronyms. One, HOPE, hold on, pain ends. And then also hearing other people's experiences. Even no matter what your age, and let's say you're in high school, middle school, and you have some friend that you feel like you trust, you say, hey, I just need to share something. I don't need necessarily for you to say anything. Could you just please listen? Because I think once that person understands, they can provide support. And ideally, if somebody trusts you with that, I think the best response can be is, how can I support you? I will go with you to report this bullying to somebody. And I think now, thanks to Scott, quite frankly, somebody like you in this position, bullying is no longer acceptable. There was hazing before. No, this will be stamped out. So I think because of, again, at your leadership, if we can get you beautiful young people, old people, just get into somebody will trust you and we can help stop that.
Great. How about the difference between mental health and emotional health?
I really think that they're one and the same. What I tell people is, somebody like myself, we are actually far more tuned into how we feel than the average person. And sometimes that acumen can help us to have a greater appreciation for the gifts of life, but also can be a hindrance. So I think there is the saying that there can be no health without mental health. I would agree. And I think because this typically is a malady of both thought and emotion and action, if we don't have the component of emotional health, which I think is most sustained by counseling and therapy and peer support, we can't get to the point of true mental health.
What are your feelings about teachers sharing their personal stories with students?
You know what? I'm a big fan. I think anytime that, I'll just share this because I've never had children. I have 3 beautiful stepchildren now who, quick story, my middle daughter, Bella, was giving me a hard time. And I said, look, people invite me to come speak. And she said, well, you don't talk about anything inspirational at home. Okay. So for a long time, I didn't think, okay, what's the 58-year-old man? What's my value going to be to a teenager? And what somebody told me was that kids seeing an adult be authentic and honest about struggles and challenges, maybe even traumatic events, they embrace that. They're so hungry for authenticity that a teacher, in an appropriate way, it makes all the difference in the world. It can, without a doubt, save somebody's life.
We have wellness centers in most of our schools here in the county. And the question is, we struggle with getting families to engage in those services, and how do we reach them more effectively?
I think it can be, part of it has to be, let me rephrase that. Part of it is to create a different conversation within the family, people who may be, at our age, in the 40 to 60 range, who still have this thought, which I can appreciate, but it's an old thinking that needs to go away, that if I move forward, because one of my beloved children has an issue around mental illness, I'm going to be stigmatized. And I don't want that sort of attention on my family. And so I think that there has to be a certain level of courage to take the unconditional love that as a parent you have for your child really just say, I really don't care what other people think, and move them in, because the services of the county, they work. I am a product of county care from Placer County. The system worked perfectly for me. I know that that's not always the case, but I have great faith in Calaveras County with all the amazing people that I'm now in relationship with. I call out to you families, please, please, please eliminate some of the suffering that your children are experiencing. Imagining if we can heal them now, they don't have to get to the point of 50 years old. You can eliminate decades of suffering, and imagine the ripple effect that that'll have in our community.
You mentioned you were a pretty good actor and you hid the signs pretty well. How do we, as friends of people that we know are struggling or probably don't know they're struggling, get through to those signs and know what to look for?
It's a great question. And you know, I said this in my talk, and it's important for me to underscore, there's nothing that my family could have done to stop me from attempting my life. It didn't do anything. And I think that it's not anybody's fault. Once we understand, we can make changes. So to answer your question, Scott, is the important thing is, if you look at signs and symptoms, they're all basically behaviorally based. And so it's basically changes in behavior. People who were very gregarious all become very quiet. People who all of a sudden are giving away all these important things that mean a lot to them in their life. People who are going around and said, hey, if something happens to me, I just need you to know this. So we have to be cognizant of subtle signs, which are almost always subtle, in changes in behavior, and then step forward. There's a great quote by Dr. Paul Quinnett, who's a psychologist, who says, it's the unasked questions that lead to tragedy. None of the questions in regards to our wondering or concern about somebody's mental health are comfortable. It just say, look, I might be off, but I feel like something's bugging you. Please tell me what's going on. It'll be confidential. I won't share it with anybody. But if they say, well, I'm going to end my life by suicide, then say, you know what, I can't keep that secret. Let's go to this point. But long-winded, back to the question, be cognizant of subtle signs of changes in behavior, and then step forward and say, look, I might be off, but I got to ask you this question. Not are you okay? It's how are you feeling? And then how can I support you? I'll walk with you. I'll go. I had a friend, Larry, who literally in the early days drove me to every single therapy appointment. Waited, we drove home, and on the first one created this routine in which he said, hey, I got to make a stop. And we went to like a liquor store, a grocery store. And he said, I'll be right back. And I'm like, okay. And he came out with 2 pints, not beer, Ben & Jerry's. I sat down in his seat and we ate ice cream. And what I realized, there is almost no ill in the world that can't be healed with brotherhood and ice cream. Like, yeah.
Great. I want to thank you very much.
Oh, absolutely.
This has been a wonderful experience.
And thank you for your
Thank you.
leadership and allowing me to be here, Scott. It's an
Thank you.
absolute honor.
Well, thank you. I know our audience got a lot out of this. You've touched a lot of hearts with those animal stories. I know there were tears out there we didn't get to see.
Well,
So
excellent.
thank you very
Thank
much.
you all very much.
Thank
you
you all
having me.
for participating. Make sure you do your surveys and be sure to join us for the rest of the day. We look forward to having you. Have a good one, Dave, guys.